The sun sets on a fourth special session of the Capitol as Texas lawmakers steel themselves to go into legislative overtime yet again. The latest today on The Standard.
Texas Standard is a production of KUT Austin, KERA North Texas, Houston Public Media, and Texas Public Radio in San Antonio.
I'm David Brown. Sergio Martinez Beltran of the Texas Newsroom with the latest on where we stand with the special session, what's passed, what hasn't, and what comes next. The Biden administration takes the wrap off a new methane emissions rule, what it means for Texas oil and gas production, and the pushback already picking up steam. Also, the latest controversy coming out of the climate summit in Dubai. In El Paso, a dinner theater like no other now facing the final curtain. The Texas Standard's Allison Rodriguez with that story and a whole lot more when the Texas Standard gets started right after this. No matter where you are, it's Texas Standard Time on this Monday, the 4th day of December 2023. I'm David Brown. When the history books are written on the 88th Texas legislative session, there will no doubt be plenty of extra space needed to explain how a part-time legislature like the one we have here in Texas would spend much of the year at the Capitol, called back repeatedly by the governor for special sessions, the fourth of which they are now in. Wait a moment. Apparently the scuttlebutt is that we're not finished. Nothing official has been announced yet, but among folks who work at the Capitol, word is that the governor, as he promised to do, will again be calling back the legislature for another special session, a fifth special session, due to the House's refusal to approve the governor's plan for education savings accounts, or ESAs. These are what critics call a voucher-like plan that would allow state funds to be used to cover private school tuition. Though this kind of arrangement has been central to conservatives' push for what they term school choice, not all Texas Republicans are on board with this idea, especially members of the House representing rural districts where there aren't as many school options. And they, like most Texas Democrats in the House, see the plan as undermining public schools. But as Sergio Martinez Beltran of the Texas Newsroom reminds us, we're still not done with the fourth special session just yet. Sergio, welcome back to the Standard.
Hi, David.
Let's not get ahead of ourselves here, but you're hearing that the Speaker of the House, Dade Phelan, sent a message to his colleagues over the weekend, right? What's he saying?
That's right. The Speaker of the House, he sent a memo to members of his chamber where he tells them that that chamber will convene at 11 a.m. on Tuesday, so tomorrow, for the purpose of concluding remaining business of the fourth called session, meaning that they are likely to sine die or adjourned until they're called back for a fifth special session or until 2025.
Wow. Okay. So let's talk about what has been done and what has been left on the table. Senate passed several bills, including a school safety funding bill and Senate Bill 6. What's that?
Right. Well, the Senate has passed a few things that actually have made it to the House and, are headed to the governor at this point, which is something that we thought a few weeks ago, David, nothing was going to happen, right? One of the bills that the Senate passed increases the penalties for operators of stash houses and human smugglers. This is part of, Governor Abbott's initiative of Operation Lone Star. He really wants law enforcement to have a bigger role in how it enforces immigration laws in the state. And so Senate Bill 4 would do that. It would also allow local and state law enforcement agencies to arrest an unauthorized immigrant, take them to a county judge or a magistrate, and that judge would then have the option to return that person to the port of entry. And then another measure that the Senate did pass was an appropriations bill that pretty much gets $1.5 billion to be spent for the construction of walls or other barriers on the southern border.
And now what about Senate Bill 6? That wasn't passed in the House. What was that?
Right. So Senate Bill 6 was filed last week by the Senate in an effort to skirt lawsuits filed by a group of far-right activists. And this lawsuit could impact actually the constitutional amendments that were passed during the November election. Remember, there were about 14 of them. They included property tax cuts and raises for retired teachers. So these lawsuits that were filed right after that election by some of these far-right activists could actually impede those amendments to take effect. So Republicans in the Texas Senate, they decided to file this bill, and what it does pretty much, it would speed up the process to challenge a constitutional amendment election. So what this law would do if it passes in the House and it's sent to the governor is that it would require the trial on these lawsuits to happen this month. That way, the property tax cuts could go into effect next month. But it seems, David, that the House is going to leave town without taking up that bill.
Wow. Okay. So remind us then, what stands out in this session in terms of legislation? You mentioned a lot of the border security measures, I think, that have passed, that the governor's been pushing for, right?
Right. I mean, the biggest things that passed during this fourth special session were border-related bills, right? But then the biggest item for the governor when he called members back a few weeks ago was school vouchers or education savings accounts. And as you mentioned, that didn't go anywhere. And I think, David, what this shows too, something that I've learned of covering this session is that it's a good reminder that just because you have a majority in the legislature doesn't mean you are going to be effective, right? The governor ran on this campaign of school vouchers and education savings accounts or giving parents choice. And here we are in the fourth special session, and the Republican majority in the legislature has not been able to deliver that promise that they made to their constituents. And also, there's even been divides over the border-related bills, like SB4, like we talked about, right? That's one of the measures that Republicans in the Senate were not in agreement at the beginning. Now that bill has a different author because the original author of SB4 said that the current provisions included there, like sending some of these migrants back to the port of entry, is unconstitutional and he cannot support it anymore.
Sergio Martinez Beltran covers state politics for the Texas Newsroom. Sounds like your work's not done just yet, Sergio. I'm sure we'll be talking with you again real soon. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
Under a new federal climate rule, Texas oil and gas companies soon will be required to significantly reduce the amount of methane they produce. The rule was announced over the weekend at the United Nations Climate Summit in Dubai. We're going to talk about that more later in the broadcast. But this development is part of an effort by the Biden administration to crack down on methane emissions, which are the second largest contributor to climate change after carbon dioxide, according to scientists. The energy sector is the main source of methane emissions in the U.S. That's especially true in Texas, which ranks as the largest oil and gas producing state in the country, but doesn't have a rule to capture methane emissions produced by the energy infrastructure. Joining the Standard to tell us more about this new rule and how it affects Texas's energy industry is Erin Douglas. She's a climate reporter for the Texas Tribune. Erin, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit first about this new federal climate rule and what exactly it would require Texas oil and gas companies to do.
Sure. So the rule is going to require operators to phase out routine flaring of natural gas, which is basically when companies burn off excess gas. And then they'll also be required to monitor their equipment for methane leaks, which is another really major source of emissions. And that just comes from normal equipment venting off gas because operators don't realize it's leaking. And though routine flaring without permission from regulators is already barred by state law, companies frequently request exceptions from this rule, and about 3,600 of those exceptions were approved last year in Texas. So this is going to be a very big change.
What do you do with the excess methane if you're not just burning it off?
Well, that's a good question. The problem in the Permian Basin for years has been that they don't have enough excess takeaway capacity, and that basically means pipelines to move the excess methane that's coming up when they drill for oil out of the oil field. Mm-hmm. And so that's why the flaring is occurring. And so operators will have to find out a way to reduce the amount of methane that they're flaring off. And I mean, I think there are some solutions. You could add more storage, you could add more pipelines, you could do things like that. And companies actually over the weekend at the UN Climate Conference, many companies, including national oil companies and ExxonMobil, announced that they agreed they would end routine flaring by 2030.
By 2030. Mm-hmm. How big of a decrease are they projecting in methane emissions?
Yeah, so the Biden administration estimates that the regulation will cut about 58 million tons of methane emissions between 2024 and 2038. And that is nearly as much carbon dioxide as emitted by the power sector in 2021. And so this rule is expected to have a pretty big impact. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, meaning it can trap a lot more heat in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide, but it doesn't last as long in the atmosphere. It only lasts a few decades rather than a few centuries. And so that means any emission reductions that we do from methane are felt relatively quickly. So it's one way to slow climate change in the short term.
Well, now, you were sort of hinting at this when you talked about the number of exceptions that have been approved by Texas officials. Mm-hmm. And I know that some Texas regulators have raised concerns that this amounts to federal overreach. Where do you think we're headed when it comes to regulatory or perhaps legal challenges in Texas?
Yeah, for sure. So Texas regulators have already suggested that they believe this could be vulnerable to legal challenges. And I don't know if you recall, but last year the Supreme Court ruled on an EPA case, West Virginia versus EPA, and that significantly limited the agency's power to regulate emissions. And so state regulators in Texas, in their comments to the EPA, said that they think the regulation could be an overreach and that new precedent means that agencies don't have the authority from Congress to address big policy questions like addressing climate change. So, yeah, I think it's fairly likely that Texas could sue, citing that new case.
We've been speaking with Erin Douglas, who covers climate issues for the Texas Tribune, and we're going to have a link to her latest at texasstandard.org and more on the COP28 summit a little later in the broadcast. Erin, thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Wells Dunbar is our social media editor, and he joins us now with a look at the talk of Texas online. Hello, Wells.
Howdy, David. Well, we're hearing from folks about the waning days of the fourth special legislative session via Facebook. Lori Von Gundy Bland says she's walking into my retired teacher meeting here in Grapevine knowing that a boost for school funding has been put on hold once again. We take a backseat to everyone else. More broadly, Tyler Malloy says this about this fourth special. He says, seems like every time you turn around the state of Texas, it's doing less and less. A government that wants to subcontract out everything from schools to roads clearly wants nothing to do with governance, but instead wants power for power's sake. Think how much better off Texans would be today if we had competent government for the last quarter century. Well, speaking of government, two proposals making waves over the weekend, Texas Democrats and Texas Republicans, with some interesting decisions over the weekend. I'll be back with those and other stories from social media after the show, Dave, or at the end of the show, David.
At the end of the indeed, about 35 minutes or so. Wells Dunbar is our social media editor, and we'd love for you to reach out. Look for Texas Standard on your social media platform of choice. You heard about the passing of Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman on the Supreme Court. She had quite the Texas connection, and we're going to be exploring it as the Standard continues.
Support for Texas Standard comes from Enel North America, generating renewable energy with projects run by and for Texans, investing in the future of local communities, schools, and small businesses. Learn more at enelnorthamerica.com/Texas.
It's the Texas Standard. I'm David Brown. Remembrances and reflections continue to come in on the long and groundbreaking life of retired Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. She died Friday at 93 years old. Her family's indicated her ashes might be spread in Arizona, the state where she spent most of her years and began her life in politics. But O'Connor was a Texan by birth. Michelle Ferrari directed a PBS documentary about her.
She had a very unusual childhood. She grew up on a 160,000-acre cattle ranch in southeastern Arizona, and there were no schools. And then when she was about 6, her parents sent her to live with her grandmother, her maternal grandmother, who lived in El Paso, and she would only return to the ranch for summers from 6 on.
O'Connor attended El Paso's Radford School, which was at the time just for girls. But her official biography on the Supreme Court website says while she was there, she was often homesick and always looked forward to returning to her parents' ranch, where she, quote, rode with the cowboys, branded cattle, and fired a .22 caliber rifle.
There's a great story about her being charged with bringing lunch to the ranch hands who were out working the roundup when she was about 14 or 15 and began driving across this untracked, untenanted landscape, no roads, and she got a flat tire and she had to change it all by herself. And needless to say, she was a bit late when she got to the roundup, but she was very proud of herself. And she said, "Dad, I had a flat tire and I fixed it." And he said, "You're late. Next time, leave earlier." And she took that with her wherever she went in life.
O'Connor became the first female U.S. Supreme Court justice in 1981. But Ferrari says she would never identify herself as a feminist.
She considered a feminist someone who was marching in the streets, and that was not who she was at all. She did do a great deal of good for women's equality during her years in the Arizona Senate and then as a Supreme Court justice, but she shunned the label of feminist.
O'Connor's confirmation to the court drew huge attention. Documentarian Michelle Ferrari says some of that attention bordered on celebrity worship, with reporters rooting through her trash. She was considered a very safe nomination to the court because she did not have radical views, or what were considered to be radical views at the time. Ferrari says that becoming a consensus builder is a big part of her court legacy.
I think the thing that most impressed me was what a nuanced thinker she was. I have a lot of respect for revolutionaries, for people who are willing to go to extremes in defense of a principle or to realize a vision for the future. But I also think it's true that in a nation of, some 300 million people, there's also a real need for compromise, for people who pull toward the middle. Justice O'Connor is kind of a shining example of why it's very important to have someone like that on the highest court in the land.
The voice of Michelle Ferrari speaking with the Texas Standard in 2021 about her PBS documentary on the life of the late Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. O'Connor retired from the court in 2006, but went on to serve in advisory roles and later founded a project aimed at engaging young people in civics. In 2009, she was awarded the country's highest civilian honor, the Presidential Medal of Freedom.
Support for Coverage of Business comes from Texas Mutual Insurance Company, a workers' comp provider committed to protecting Texas employers by investigating fraud and focused on preventing abuse of the system. More at texasmutual.com/fraud.
And you are listening to the Texas Standard. The University of Texas at El Paso's Dinner Theater is the only year-round theater of its kind in the United States. For the past 4 decades, it's produced hundreds of plays, won dozens of awards, and helped generations of aspiring actors hone their craft. But the Texas Standard's Allison Rodriguez reports that Dinner Theater is now facing some big changes.
We've got heart. All you really need is heart.
Damn Yankees kicked off this season of performances. It's the first season without founding director Greg Taylor. And he was shocked to learn it will also be its farewell season.
No, at no time did they ever say to me that we're thinking of closing the Dinner Theater.
Taylor founded the Dinner Theater in 1983, while he was still an undergraduate himself at UTEP. He's been working with students like Chloe Curtis ever since.
That's the crazy thing, is that 40 years ago, when there was just the theater and dance department, the Dinner Theater didn't exist. Greg Taylor wanted to do a musical, and the theater and dance department said no, because they don't do musicals. So he went and got funding from somewhere else and started a musical, and just put on a musical. And then 40 years later, we have one of the best theaters in the region. And I think that's incredible, and what an incredible legacy that is.
Taylor retired from the job on August 31st. In a Facebook post that day, he talks about the legacy he built and how it will live on. But just 1 month later, another Facebook post begins, "This is so sad and disappointing."
So unfortunately, I'm not there. If I was still there, I would be fighting this tooth and nail.
That was in response to news that UTEP now planned to close the theater and lay off the entire staff after the end of this season. Taylor says that the UTEP administration never mentioned this as a possible outcome.
I would have stayed another year and closed it myself. I would have been there for, the end. I started it. I'll be there at the end of it.
The next few days were a massive confusion for Dinner Theater supporters and students like Chloe Curtis.
So all we know is that the Dinner Theater put out their season and it said farewell season. And we were like, whoa, what's going on? And when we try to ask questions, we get a lot of non-answers.
She and other students created the Save the UTEP Dinner Theater initiative. They started social media pages and a petition that has nearly 5,000 signatures.
So many people have come out of the woodwork that I've never met or like heard of or anything, talking about how much the dinner theater has meant to them. I know a lot of people that are working professionally in theater that they say that they owe their professional training to the UTEP dinner theater.
That includes performance major Fernando Romero, who credits the dinner theater as a launching pad.
To me, I came in with my own story, and I just grew. I just grew as an actor, I grew as a performer, I grew as a person.
The university scheduled and then canceled an interview for this story. Instead, they pointed me to written statements. One from October 4th says, quote, "Musical theater at UTEP is not going away. The same professional-grade musicals produced for decades by the UTEP Dinner Theater will continue at UTEP for seasons to come."
So basically they're saying, yeah, we're going to get rid of the dinner theater, but we'll keep doing musicals and you'll all be happy. And that's not what everyone's going to go for.
Romero worries that cutting ties to the dinner theater's unique history is as bad as doing away with musical theater altogether.
That's going to cause the dinner theater to close, like cause everything that makes it special to go away. It does something that is unique to itself, not just in El Paso, but like in the whole country.
On October 20th, UTEP issued another update saying, quote, "UTEP has formed an internal committee charged to develop a plan for the future of musical theater at UTEP. It says that committee includes current theater staff and will have recommendations before the end of this semester. Chloe Curtis hopes they've listened to students like her.
To be able to put on productions of such a high caliber and quality, like, it's almost, like, unheard of.
For Greg Taylor, it isn't the retirement legacy he imagined, but he's found a silver lining.
I didn't start any of this. This groundswell of reaction has come from the people, from the students, from the former students.
The UTEP Dinner Theater is now casting for February's production of We Will Rock You. They'll have 2 more shows in what's still billed as its farewell season. I'm Allison Rodriguez for the Texas Standard.
Support for Texas Standard comes from Texas Oncology, conducting cancer research and clinical trials in the pursuit of new drug therapies, innovations in radiation therapy, and advances in screening and diagnosing methods. More at texasoncology.com. Support for Texas Standard comes from the Texas College Savings Plan, administered by the state of Texas. Families can save for tuition, room and board, books, and other qualified education expenses at eligible schools nationwide. Learn more at texascollegesavings.com.
From the Texas Newsroom, I'm Matt Harrod.
Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton says he's going back to court to try to keep the state's border buoy barrier in the Rio Grande near Eagle Pass. Texas Public Radio's David Martin Davies reports the Biden administration asked the court to order Texas to remove the barrier within 10 days.
On Friday, a federal appeals court sided with the Biden administration and ordered the orange buoys be removed from the river separating Texas and Mexico. A 3-judge panel on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals lifted a stay and rejected Governor Abbott's claim that Texas is being invaded. It instead found that the barrier is a hazard. Speaking on Fox News on Saturday, Paxton said he will appeal to the full Fifth Circuit or to the U.S. Supreme Court. I'm David Martin Davies in San Antonio.
The state of Texas is in federal court today, arguing that the federal government should not take over parts of its foster care system and that it should not be fined for contempt. Texas Public Radio's Paul Flav reports on the 12-year-old federal lawsuit.
Lawyers representing current and former foster kids argue the state commits medical neglect by over-medicating them, that it failed to comprehensively investigate placements for children with intellectual disabilities, and that the state continues to endanger youth by putting them in hotels or rented homes with untrained staffers, among other allegations. For this, they have asked for hefty fines or a federal takeover of parts of the system. Judge Janice Jack has fined the state on one other occasion. Lawyers say the hearing is expected to last between 2 days and 2 weeks. I'm Paul Flav in San Antonio.
Over 150 protesters marched in downtown San Antonio on Saturday to express their demands for a ceasefire in Gaza and a broader call to end Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories. San Antonio for Justice in Palestine hosted the rally alongside the Jewish Justice for Peace, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and UTSA student organizations. Texas Public Radio's Josh Peck reports.
San Antonio for Justice in Palestine hosted the rally alongside the Jewish Voice for Peace, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and local university student organizations. Judith Norman is the chief organizer for Jewish Voice for Peace in San Antonio. She spoke at the rally.
We are essential here. Our actions matter, and if the violence in Palestine has been unprecedented, so has been our response.
3 city council members have publicly endorsed a ceasefire, but a resolution has not been put forward. City councils in Seattle, Detroit, Oakland, and other American cities have passed ceasefire resolutions. I'm Josh Peck in San Antonio.
I'm Matt Harab in the Texas Newsroom.
You're listening to statewide news from public radio stations across Texas. This coverage is only possible because of support from listeners like you. You can help sustain and grow Texas news coverage by donating to your local public radio station today.
33 minutes past the hour, Texas Standard Time. I'm David Brown. The 2023 United Nations Climate Change Conference is well underway. If that name sounds a little unfamiliar to you, you may have heard it referred to as COP28 for Conference of the Parties. This year's event runs through December 12th, and it's being held in Dubai, a choice certainly not without controversy. Matt Smith has been keeping an eye on this. He's energy analyst for Kepler, and he joins us now. Matt, welcome back.
Thanks, David.
First of all, tell us a little bit more about what is COP28 and why folks are paying so much attention to it, what we can expect is perhaps a result from it.
Sure. So as you mentioned there, it's a Conference of the Parties. It's actually the 28th annual United Nations climate meeting, hence the 28, COP28 there. And it's basically where governments come together to discuss and make commitments about climate change. So there's about 200 governments that have been invited to the conference. And why we should pay attention to it and what we should expect is that we should expect further commitments to limit global temperatures from rising. And so focus will be on a few things, David, a couple of key things, including a commitment to pivot to clean energy sources, so renewable energy, but also a focus on transferring investments from richer countries to poorer countries to essentially sponsor the efforts for climate change.
I mentioned that this has not been without controversy, and
right.
One of the first reasons, of course, the location for it. What's the backstory there?
Wow. So there's a few reasons, really. So not the least being the fact that the UAE is one of the leading oil producers in the world. It's in the top 10 and only behind the likes of the US, Russia, and Saudi, and a few others. Not only that, but the Emiratis have also negotiated a higher oil production level starting next year because of investments they've made. So last week we heard that OPEC Plus has just initiated a new round of voluntary cuts in the last week, and UAE is going to be trying to keep its production up. It will push it higher. So not only that, but the president of COP28 climate talks is the CEO of the state-owned oil company. But in his defense, though, David, his name's Mr. Ahmed Al-Jaber. He's the country's climate envoy and the chairman of the government-owned renewable energy company, which he helps set up. But from looking from the outside in, it does look as if he has distinctly polarized loyalties, right?
Well, I was just reading some comments that The Guardian published over the weekend. Apparently, he was quoted as saying in that report that there is no science behind calls for a phase-out of fossil fuels. This from the president of the climate conference. Now, that's set off quite a few alarm bells among people who see this as the last best opportunity to do something about climate change and reduce the reliance on fossil fuels.
Yeah, and that's exactly that kind of conflict of interest it seems to be in place there. That said, though, David, there has been a pledge over the weekend by oil and gas companies essentially relating to getting to net zero targets, so essentially offsetting all of their carbon emissions. And so you've got a total of about 50 companies that represent 40% of global oil production that have signed this charter, basically. And so it does involve a number of state-controlled entities, but also the super majors and also Occidental from the US here, as well as Exxon. So there is that, but also from the oil and gas side of things, perhaps what is just as important is there's been a commitment to increase transparency via measuring and monitoring and the reporting of emissions. And so you do need this increasing scrutinization of oil and gas companies and the industry as a whole here.
Earlier in our program, we were talking about a new methane emission rule from the Biden administration. Is that is that coming out as a result of this COP28 conference? And have you heard about other commitments made by the U.S.?
Yeah, absolutely. So US officials unveiled new rules at the conference over the weekend aimed on cracking down on methane emissions. So Vice President Kamala Harris and the EPA spoke about their renewed efforts to cut these emissions, as banning routine flaring of natural gas as well produced from newly drilled oil wells. You've also had John Kerry, who's the US Special Envoy for Climate, has announced that the US is committing to not build any more new coal plants and phase out existing ones. But again, David, there's been no specific timeline given to these being taken offline here. So, it's still a bit of the waters have been muddied somewhat there.
Yeah. Well, this climate conference continues through the 12th, so it's going to be interesting to see what develops and what doesn't. And you can bet that Matt Smith is going to be following this as energy analyst for Kepler. Matt, thanks so much for the update, and we'll be talking with you again real soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, David.
Support for coverage of energy comes from Enel North America, generating renewable energy with projects run by and for Texans, investing in the future of local communities, schools, and small businesses. Learn more at enelnorthamerica.com/Texas. Support for Texas Standard comes from Texas Center for Proton Therapy, offering radiation treatment that precisely targets cancer with a focused proton beam just a few millimeters wide. More at texasprotons.com.
It's the Texas Standard. I'm David Brown. This holiday season, there is an alternative to bright lights and flashy displays. In Rockport, you can step back in time to the late 1800s and celebrate as the Victorians did in the Gilded Age. KEDT's Kathy Edwards takes us there.
If you're looking for a way to enjoy an old-fashioned Christmas or to learn about how people celebrated the holidays in the past, you'll want to visit the Fulton Mansion State Historic Site located in Rockport, Texas. George and Harriet Fulton built the four-story structure overlooking Aransas Bay in 1877. The site is located at 317 Fulton Beach Road in Rockport. And this Thursday, December 7th, the Fulton Mansion is having a special Victorian Christmas event from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. Esmeralda Salinas is an educator at the Fulton Mansion. She says there'll be lots of delightful holiday activities going on.
There's a Victorian Santa that you can take a picture with, and George Fulton will be making his presence there, and we'll be reading 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. He'll be reading that to round us out in the evening, and it'll be the only time the house is open to the public after hours. So it'll be a nice little experience to see it lit up at night and all of her Christmas glory.
Interestingly, Victorians would have had a smaller Christmas tree than what we're familiar with in the 21st century.
It is a tabletop Christmas tree, which you don't really see anymore, and that is a Victorian tradition. Although, fun fact, the floor-to-ceiling Christmas tree was actually an American thing that happened around a little bit later, like the 1860s.
And a Victorian Santa might look a little different than a modern Mr. Claus.
His coat is a little bit longer. There's some other detailing on his waistcoat and his belt and that. So it's a little bit more old world as opposed to our modern Santas that are these bright red with the big black buckle. And that's more of a modern kind of convention of Santa. But old Victorian Santa would have been, a little bit longer. He would have been hooded. He wouldn't have had a hat.
That's Esmeralda Salinas, educator at the Fulton Mansion. The Fulton Mansion's Victorian Christmas event is this Thursday, December 7th, at the Fulton Mansion State Historic Site, 317 Fulton Beach Road in Rockport. More information can be found at visitfultonmansion.com. In Corpus Christi, I'm Kathy Edwards.
A San Antonio arts lover had a dream of a cultural exchange with Cuba. Hadn't been easy to make it a reality, but Texas Public Radio's Jack Morgan reports she's about to take a big step in that direction.
Angela Martinez runs Slab Cinema, which sets up an inflatable screen at various places around town, then shows movies. but her endeavors have an underlying motive.
It's not about showing outdoor movies per se. It's about creating something that allows people to come together as a community and to make memories.
With that as premise, Martina cites a trip to Cuba 7 years ago with their 2 children as the genesis for her current effort.
The first time I went was back in 2016. Obama was coming the next week.
But my time here in Cuba renews my hope and my confidence in what the Cuban people will do. We can make this journey as friends and as neighbors and as family. Sí se puede. Muchas gracias.
And the Rolling Stones were on the way, and that was at a different time, and it was during the Cuban thaw.
After President Obama lifted American travel restrictions to Cuba, the Rolling Stones shot Havana Moon, a concert film, at a Cuban stadium.
So they had opened up the access to Cuba, and we went and we just fell in love. And then I went back in April to do a scouting mission for this project.
Martinez also curates exhibits from time to time at Blue Star, so her interest in art is clear.
Art is a uniting force. And when I went to Cuba and started talking to the artists, and they just talked about the importance of art in their lives, and I just thought if we could use art as a way to collaborate and engage and build a community between San Antonians and Cubans, that could be something very special and very powerful and something that isn't really done.
She's devised a name for this big effort. It's called the San Havana Project.
San Antonio artists are going to Cuba. We're going to engage with the Cuban artists. We're going to have an art show. San Antonio artists are going to have a show, and then the Cuban artists hopefully will bring back some work and show it here.
My name is Gary Sweeney, and I'm an artist and resident of San Antonio, Texas.
Sweeney is one of those artists who is going.
My wife and I were there in 2012 and 2015. We're excited about this being our third trip.
Americans don't get to just visit because they want to. Trips to Cuba have to contain a stated objective.
There are 12 categories where they allow people to visit from the United States officially, and one of them is culture, and they're really big on the arts there.
The San Havana Project clearly falls within a couple of possible categories. Sweeney says preparing to go to Cuba reminds one of the peculiar, strained relations between Cuba and the U.S.
When we went down there, I just thought that the island was completely isolated, and then we've discovered that it's only isolated to Americans.
Sweeney says that's a shame because there's a natural affinity between the cultures.
They really like Americans down there, but they don't like what our government has been doing to them.
Many Americans' first exposure to Cuba's arts scene came by virtue of a 1999 multi-award-winning documentary called The Buena Vista Social Club, which documented through music a group of veteran Havana musicians. Cuba making vacationing there a complicated process wasn't a random decision, but the result of some dicey history between Cuba and the U.S.
There were the Bay of Pigs invasion. We tried to assassinate Fidel Castro. So when you wonder why they're clamped down, they don't want to be saved by us, but they'd like us to be friends again. This is the people I'm talking about.
Martina says her 2 visits, including talking with many artists, has her concluding that art holds a higher station there.
I do believe the Cuban culture might value arts more than we do.
And what clues tell you that?
When I go there, art is everywhere. It's just art, art, art. The artists are happy. You talk to the artists, they're gratified. I believe that they're making a living with their art.
She says that while researching the project, she came across another reason to make the art interchange.
So I wanted to go to Cuba, and I was looking for a legal reason to do so. And as I was filling out the paperwork, I saw it said if you make a documentary, then that's like a journalistic endeavor.
My name's Anthony S. Garcia of JoJo Dancer Photography.
Garcia is one of 7 artists going along, and it's him who's shooting footage and stills for the project.
I'm going to do as much video as I can and bring it back to do some kind of mini documentary.
As a photographer, Garcia is an artist, and he's also going to exhibit some of the photos for the Havana showing.
Anywhere from 5 to 7 prints, maybe a few more. I don't know exactly what the number will be. I got a week to figure that one out.
Martina says that week is now wound down by a couple of days.
We're leaving Monday.
And you'll be back on the 9th?
Yes, we'll be back Friday.
There's not a big financial incentive. Cuba won't at this time let San Antonians sell their art prints in Cuba, nor will they allow Cuban artists to sell at a San Antonio exhibit. Martinez's objectives are higher-minded than just commerce.
I just thought if we could use art as a way to collaborate and engage and build a community between San Antonians and Cubans, that could be something very special and very powerful and something that isn't really done. I'm just using it as a way to build community and to try to bring some good in the world where I can.
We'll be following this story and keep you informed on how it all plays out. I'm Jack Morgan in San Antonio.
It's the Texas Standard. I'm David Brown. Men outnumber women in the Texas legislature by more than 2-to-1. And this organization's trying to change that. Annie's List works to recruit, train, and elect specifically progressive women in Texas, not just at the Capitol, but at all levels of state and local government. Annie's List turns 20 years old this month, and in that time, they've raised $20 million and helped candidates win over 160 races, according to their website. We're joined now by Ana Ramon. She is the executive director of Annie's List. Ana, welcome to the Texas Standard.
Thank you for having me, David. Excited to be here.
To start with, tell us a little bit more about your mission and why you think it's so important.
Without a doubt, there's nothing more important to us than reflective democracy. And with women in particular holding so much power in the electoral space in Texas, making sure that that is reflected, that is something that Annie's List has been focused on for the last 20 years. And as you mentioned, really excited to be a part of over even 170 women's journeys to elected office in Texas.
Now, you mentioned some of the different levels. Does Annie's List focus on all races at all levels? I mean, all the way up to national offices?
What's exciting is we're a state PAC, so we get to help anyone from council on up, including statewide offices. We were honored to be a part of some statewide efforts in 2022, but our training efforts actually go all the way down. When you're talking about building the pipeline, building the next generation of candidates, we want to be a part of that journey. So we get to do everything from school board all the way to attorney general.
I'm curious, why focus on progressive women? Why not work to get, say, conservative women elected as well?
Well, what's exciting is you have an entire, like as I mentioned, a generation of women who understand what Texas needs are. We have seen it time and time again. The priorities for women in Texas and for Texans in general are having access to healthcare, having safety in schools, making sure our schools are funded, everything that's reflected in what progressive candidates and progressive women like we want to in our literal byline and our mission is making sure that people have access and control over their body and autonomy in Texas, which unfortunately has been stripped from us, starting in Texas, but now nationally. And having that fight and making sure that those women who are willing to step into the arena are fully funded and ready to go, that is something that is core to the work of Annie's List.
I want to get to this training aspect that you were talking about a little bit earlier. If a woman is interested in running for office, wants help from Annie's List, what might that look like, and what sort of resources do you have available?
Yes, so we are actually starting one of the first pipeline table in Texas, which has consisted of over 30 in-person trainings in Texas this year alone, with over 150 people trained. And this is men and women. Everyone is welcome. If you want to come and get an education on what it means to start a finance program all the way to field, like that's what we're here for, because we don't want to be another barrier for anyone looking to run for office. Of course, we have our mission and people are hopefully aligned to that, but we're just really excited to not only begin that work and do that regionally in some of the fastest growing parts of Texas, but our cores where we have wonderful growth and opportunity in electing more Texas women up and down the ballot. But also, what does it mean to build in like years of people who are going to not only be running for office, but also helping people get elected?
You know, you look back at 20 years since the founding of Annie's List. How would you say the landscape has changed more broadly when it comes to electing women to public office in Texas?
You know, what we've seen is women stepping up and running and winning. And that's been really exciting. Even in the most recent look at where Texas women are going. You even see the fact that women, in particular, like looking at the Texas legislature right now, are holding the floor against some of the most egregious pieces of legislation, again, immigration issues, abortion issues, et cetera. You have these women who are not only being elected to run, they're being elected to lead. And that has been really phenomenal to be a part of that. But on top of everything else, you have just the fact that Texas needs more women in office because they need to be reflected in the leadership of the general population. And landscape-wise, I can't tell you how excited people are. I know it can feel real down and dreary in the pink dome in the legislature, but what we're seeing is a new generation of women. In the top 10 races for 2024, we're actually seeing almost the majority having young women, especially women of color, stepping up and saying, it's my time. And we really want to be a part of that journey and with them on the road to 2024.
Ana Ramon is the executive director of Annie's List. Ana, thanks so much for speaking with us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And you are listening to the Texas Standard. As promised, Wells Dunbar, our social media editor, is back with more listener comments and what folks are talking about online. Wells, welcome back.
Howdy, David. Well, as I mentioned earlier, some interesting political developments over the weekend, including this: the Texas Democratic Party calling for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, the first state party in the country to do so by their telling. State party chairman Gilberto Hinojosa said in a statement about the motion from the party's executive committee that, quote, "There is no difference between the cries of Israeli and Palestinian civilians, and the senseless killings of innocent lives must come to an end." Meanwhile, Texas Republicans voted down a call to ban association with white supremacist and Holocaust deniers. This development coming over the weekend as well from the Republican Executive Committee. They voted to strip language from a pro-Israel resolution banning association with people or groups, quote, "known to espouse or tolerate anti-Semitism, pro-Nazi sympathies, or Holocaust denial." And of course, this coming in the wake of big fallout on between certain Republican factions over one far-right Republican at the time, head of influential PAC Political Action Committee, his meeting with white supremacists. As the Texas Tribune reported, when this motion was voted down, one committee member complained, quote, "It could put you on a slippery slope, that vote failing 32-29, causing a lot of consternation online. On our Facebook page, Barbara Stansfield Terry is incredulous at the language from another person who called the wording too vague. Also, Jimmy Kelly on our Facebook page, seemingly in support of a ceasefire, says he's not surprised by either proposal. One Republican weighing in online as well, House Speaker Dade Phelan. He took to X, formerly Twitter, to call the vote despicable. The state Republican Executive Committee can't even bring themselves to denounce neo-Nazis and Holocaust deniers or cut ties with their top donor who brought them to the dance. He says there is a moral anti-Semitic rot festering within the fringes of both parties that must be stopped. So interesting developments there, and a sign of this sort of continued internal civil war between factions of the Texas Republican Party that we're keeping a close watch on. In far decidedly different news, Dominic Martinez is talking about a big talker here. He says the Texas Longhorns are in the college football playoffs. Yes, after their drubbing of OSU, Oklahoma State University, over the weekend there. So yeah, possibly going to the big dance here. It looks like they are slated to play New Year's Day. In
Washington.
The Sugar Bowl, against number 2 Washington. And the winner of that going on to the playoff championship game in Houston, Texas, coming on January 8th. So,
a lot of excitement this weekend, especially as folks were waiting to see who would fill up that number 4 slot. It turned out to be Alabama over Florida State, which had an undefeated season. Some controversy there. Wells Dunbar continues to monitor your comments. Keep them coming in. We'll be back here tomorrow, and we certainly hope you can join us.
Philanthropic support for Texas Standard comes from Casey and Scott O'Hare, the Winkler Family Foundation, Lynn Dobson and Greg Woldridge, Adrian Killam, and the George Huntington family.
If you want to know what's going on in the world, then you need to know what's going on in Texas. Every weekday on the Texas Standard, we bring you stories from across the state that affect what's going on elsewhere. As part of the NPR network, an independent coalition of public media podcasters, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Michael Marks. Talk to you tomorrow.
I'm Ike Evans, host of a new podcast from KUT, Mind of Texas. Each month, we bring you a discussion on what's happening in Texas and its effect on our mental health. Find Mind of Texas at KUT.org or wherever you get your podcasts.